Mr. Pai is the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. He's joining us the day before a big vote at the FCC on net neutrality. I know people have been going utterly insane over net neutrality. Ajit Pai has been receiving actual death threats, like people threatening his life, over this proposal to reverse net neutrality, which was a regulatory regime put in place by the Obama administration in 2015. And supposedly, if this regulatory regime disappears, then the internet will end forever. I am not an expert in this, as I've stated before, but Mr. Pai is. So, Ajit Pai, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, why don't we start with the basics? What is net neutrality, and why should anybody care about it?
The first part of that is a very difficult question. It's one of the most successful marketing slogans of all time. I mean, after all, who could be against neutrality? The other problem is that it's been around for a number of years, and it's morphed to mean essentially whatever people want it to mean. But at the end of the day, what it means to most advocates is putting the government, bureaucrats and lawyers here in Washington, in charge of how the internet is governed. And that's a basic question. If you want the government to start running the internet, then you favor net neutrality. If you favor a free market approach, as I do and as many other people do, then you want the light touch approach we had prior to 2015 when these regulations were imposed.
Okay, so what I've heard and what this seems to break down to is treating internet service providers basically as utilities. So companies like Verizon, you get your internet from them and you buy an internet uplink, and now you are able to get all of this content coming through your uplink. Net neutrality basically, correct me if I'm wrong, net neutrality is designed so that all of the people who are actually putting content online are paying the same amount for putting that content online regardless of the amount of bandwidth they're taking up. So Netflix is paying the same as some schlub in his basement who is uploading information to his local blog. And net neutrality ending that would basically allow these various internet service providers to charge differently for various pieces of content that are uploaded to the internet. They might allow people to download content differently. You can get a different subscription plan from different providers. Is that essentially correct?
That's basically correct. That essentially net neutrality involves regulating all of these companies like utilities, treating your internet service provider as you would your water company or electric company or subway system. And the argument I've made is the internet is not like any of those things. It's certainly important increasingly in our daily lives, but the internet also scales dramatically over time. And 20 years ago, we were talking about 28K modems and AOL CD-ROMs in the mail and email being the killer app. Now we're talking about gigabit fiber and 4G LTE and high-definition wireless streaming. And so the way the internet has developed is scalable, so to speak, in a way that utilities, as we traditionally think about them, are not. And the argument I've made is that treating the internet like another slow-moving utility guarantees that you're going to have a slow-moving utility providing the internet. And that's the last thing I think that consumers want. They seem to want better, faster, cheaper internet access, not another DMV in their lives.
So the question that I've heard from the other side on net neutrality has basically been that while we say that there should be open competition, maybe new internet service providers will come in, smaller internet service providers to compete and drive the price down and drive the quality up, just as with every other good in the marketplace. The local monopolies, local regulations make it nearly impossible for there to be that many internet service providers in a given area. So we may say that, you know, Comcast, okay, fine, let's say that Comcast wants to privilege Netflix and downgrade Hulu, for example. And we may say, okay, well, there'll be another internet service provider. We'll just not use Comcast anymore. We'll use Verizon, and no problem. We'll switch over because obviously we don't like how they're doing business. There are a lot of people who argue, well, you look at the way that a lot of these local internet service providers are regulated, and they're basically regulated. They're treated like monopolies. They're given special privileges by local government. Do we have to attach conditions to that to deal with that fact that maybe you only have Comcast? So if Comcast is privileging Netflix, you have no choice but to have Comcast.
Two different points. Number one, I agree that we need more competition, and that's why over the last 11 months that I've been in office as the chairman of the FCC, we've undertaken a number of initiatives to promote a lot more competition, getting more wireless spectrum out there for wireless carriers to use, making it easier for smaller fiber providers to enter the marketplace, getting the next generation of satellite companies into the marketplace to provide an alternative to the terrestrial folks. So we're promoting more competition that way. Number two, ironically, these heavy-handed internet regulations imposed by the FCC in 2015 take us in the opposite direction. They make it harder. It's already hard as it is for a lot of these smaller internet service providers to build a business case for deploying internet infrastructure, especially in rural and low-income urban areas. these regulations make it even harder. In the last week alone, I've spoken to small internet service providers that nobody has ever heard of from Minnesota, Montana, who have said that these regulations make it harder to raise capital, to build a business case for deployment, and actually spend the money and the time building out these networks. And so, ironically enough, these rules take us closer to an oligopoly or monopoly in some of these situations. And so the solution to me is to get rid of the regulations that are standing in the way of competition, not preemptively regulating how the internet operates here in Washington.
So why do you think this is driven so much higher? Because obviously, I mean, you're getting death threats. When I cut a short video on net neutrality, basically explaining it in very basic layman's terms, there's a lot of blowback on that. People are very passionate about this idea. Is it just because of the propaganda that's put out about it that people think that the next thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to come along, take their internet connection away, force them to pay a fortune for Hulu or Netflix or for email, that they're going to parcel out all of this because now you're giving Comcast the opportunity to screw everyone? Like, what exactly do you think is driving all the anger?
I think the charitable explanation is that the internet is increasingly important in our daily lives. We rely on it from the minute we wake up almost until the minute we go to sleep every night. The less charitable explanation is ideology. When you have some people, especially those who are committed to government regulation as a religion, essentially, who go around saying, look, the internet is about to be broken, democracy is about to be destroyed, free expression and speech online is about to be threatened, and here is a picture of the guy who's doing it. That is an ideological commitment that has nothing to do with the facts. It has everything to do with their ideology, which is the government should rule everything and any dissenting views should be squelched. And people who advocate for those views should be demonized personally.
Well, it is a big vote, and that's coming up at the FCC tomorrow. So if you have input, then make sure that you get it over to the FCC today, because the vote is happening tomorrow. Ajit Pai, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, thanks so much for joining us here on the Ben Shapiro Show, and thanks for the work that you're doing to deregulate, because obviously the regulatory regimes put in place as sort of a poison pill by the Obama administration with the help of the media are not going to benefit, I think, consumers either in the short or the long run. So thanks for the hard work you're doing.
Really appreciate it. And as I've often said, hell hath no fury like a regulator bored. So we're trying to infuse more of the free market approach here at the FCC to make sure that we let the private sector do the heavy lifting, not bureaucrats here in Washington.
Well, we appreciate it. Ajit Pai, again, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, thanks so much for joining.
Neutrality. A lot of people, a lot of famous people have very strong opinions about net neutrality. They warn if it's repealed, a handful of tech companies will have total control over the internet. Wait, doesn't that already describe the status quo? Ajit Pai is the chairman of the FCC. He's been the center of a lot of criticism recently, and he joins us tonight. Great to see you.
Great to see you, too.
So here's, and I actually don't know what I think of this, but here's the line that if net neutrality is rolled back, that a handful of companies will be able to control content. And if they don't like what they're seeing or you're broadcasting, they can shut it down. Should we be worried about that?
No, I think what net neutrality repeal would actually mean is that we once again have a free and open internet. The government will not be regulating how internet service providers, how anyone else in the internet economy manages their networks. And so I think we had that free market approach for 20 years, starting in President Clinton's time,
right,
in 1996, all the way through 2015. The internet wasn't broken when the Obama FCC decided to try to fix it. And we've seen the effects of these regulations over the last 2 years. It's made for worse infrastructure investment, less innovation, and I think that's part of the reason why these regulations need to go.
But I guess what's changed is we're in the middle of the biggest witch hunt in American history, and corporations are complicit in that. So what would happen if this is repealed and the Southern Poverty Law Center says, you know, I saw Fox News the other night, that's hate speech, internet service provider shut them down. What would prevent the service provider from doing that?
Well, one thing is that the FCC requires transparency. If any ISP engaged in that kind of conduct, they would have to disclose it. Additionally, the Federal Trade Commission would have jurisdiction over it. But I think you've actually put your finger on something that's very important that I've talked about. Where is the real threat to the free and open internet? And one of the things that people have suggested is it's not internet service providers, it's some of the content companies that decide what you see on the internet and, more importantly, what you don't see. Where's the transparency there? Shouldn't we have a conversation that involves them as well?
Why don't we? So you have two companies, Google and Facebook, that control 90% of all digital ad dollars. That means they basically control all news on the internet. Nobody ever says anything about it. Nobody appears worried by it. Why is that?
I'm not sure why, but you do see rumblings on Capitol Hill. Members of both parties and both houses are a little bit worried about what's going on the internet in terms of transparency and how some of these decisions are being made. And I, too, have raised some of these concerns. When Twitter, for example, restricted Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn's YouTube video announcing her run for the Senate, in part because of her pro-life views. And same thing with YouTube demonetizing Diamond and Silk, some Trump supporters, and Dennis Prager's videos. I mean, a lot of these decisions impinge on the free expression online that we've all come to cherish, but there's no real transparency into how these decisions are being made.
And there's never any outcry, whereas there is with net neutrality. And again, I'm not even sure what I think of it, but it does seem like someone's spending a lot of money to lobby public opinion on this subject, the opinions of famous people. Is it the big tech companies lobbying against
I'm not sure who exactly is funding all of these things, but what I can say is that the hysteria has reached a pitch which is completely disproportionate to the facts. I mean, as I said, we weren't living in a broken internet in 2015. All of these harms that these celebrities and whatnot are talking about are all hypothetical. There's no market failure here. Internet service providers are not and have not blocked content willy-nilly. And we're confident going forward that given the robust rules that we have and that the Federal Trade Commission has, they won't going forward as well.
But we know Facebook, Google, and Twitter have blocked content willy-nilly and continue to, and nobody does anything about it. Mr. Pai, thank you for coming on. Great to see you.
Good to see you, too.
We'll be back in just a minute.